And we're live. Hello, everyone. It's Jenny, and I'm here with Monica, the lovely, lovely Monica. I'm so excited to talk about Pachinko by Minjin Lee, which is our Reading Color Book Club pick for August. It's a huge book, and I'm so excited because there's just so many amazing things to talk about. And I know a lot of you are excited for this one, so I can't wait to get into it. But before we discuss the book, I am going to get everyone to leave a heart emoji if you've read the book and a smiley if you haven't finished it, just so we can get a gauge of like who's read it, who hasn't, and how many spoilers we can get into right from the start. And while you do that, I'm going to get Monica to tell us a little bit about herself and also the book.
Hello, I'm Monica. I'm also a YouTube creator and lover of Korean fiction. And yeah, I'm super excited to talk about Pachinko. This is one of my all-time favorite books. This takes place. We start off in the early 1900s, and at its core, this book is basically a multi-generational novel where we start with one woman, Sunja, and we follow her throughout the sort of generations after her, through living or being born in Korea and then living through Japan's colonization of Korea, and their immigration to Japan and what it was like to grow up Korean in Japan. And through all of that, we get this really sweeping story of this Korean family that I just love with my whole heart.
That was such a good description. I feel like you hit all the like high level points. It's always interesting to see how people like describe books because like I feel like when you're reading, you're like I can't put into words what this is about, but it's fantastic. But you hit it. So I'm super excited to talk about this one, and I see already we have a lot of hearts of people who have read the book,
Yay!
so that makes me really really happy. And I feel like we could just sort of get into it. If you're still rolling in, still leave me your emojis. But let's start discussing. One thing I wanted to do for some of the previous live shows and that I haven't really gotten to do is ask people what they had expected of the book before they started it, which I think is an interesting place to start with. So, what did
Yeah.
you expect of the book? Or, like, what did you think it was going to be about before
Oh
you
man.
started it?
I don't even know. It's been so long since I
Yeah.
first read it, so I don't even know if I could get into that mindset of like what I expected at the time
Yeah.
period. Um, in my head now, I feel like it did everything that I expected it to do in the
Okay.
sense of like being this historical fiction. I feel like I don't know if I expected it to have such like an emotional
Mm,
impact on me, I guess, is maybe the one thing. But yeah, I feel like that's such a hard question because I've read this book so long ago for the first
yeah.
time. I mean, what about you? I'd love to know your thoughts.
Well, this one felt really interesting to me because I think I went into it, I knew it was an intergenerational story. I knew it was about this Korean family. I honestly thought it was going to more follow just Sanja as a character throughout the book. And I think what surprised me about it was not only like the expansive look at all these different characters and generations, but also the way that the history was so tightly woven into the story. And not in like I'm just spewing out like historical facts, but like it's really embedded in the lives of all the characters, and you're seeing how the politics and the colonization and everything that's going on has deeply affected their lives. And I think um the book just did such a good job of like showing that through so many characters, which I just loved so much.
Yeah.
Someone in the comments says I went in blind knowing nothing about it beyond that it covered multiple generations. I didn't expect much. I was actually thinking I wouldn't love it, but then I read it and it's my favorite book ever. I love
Yay!
that. Yay. We love expectations overturned. Yeah, I had a very similar experience, and I think we can talk about our general thoughts, I guess, on like how we feel about it. I can go first. I posted about this on Instagram like a bunch of times this week because I was finishing up the book and I was like, I need to just, express to the world how much I love this. Honestly, this book has become like one of my all-time favorite books ever, which I wasn't
Yay!
expecting. Not that I thought it was going to be bad, but I just didn't think it would like hit me that hard. I am personally like I was a history major in university, so I love history, and I actually studied a lot of like Korean and Japanese history, especially this like particular period. So I actually didn't know that going into the book. I knew she travels to Japan, but it never clicked that like she was there during the colonial period. So it was so interesting reading all of that, and I love the emotional arcs of the story, and I think it was just like so complex overall that I just loved it. Like so many things about it I loved. And for a book that was so long, like it's almost I think 400, oh, it's 500 pages. Yeah. For a book that's so long, I feel like no moment felt slow or dull for me. Like I was
Mhm.
captivated the entire time. So yeah, favorite book of like one of my favorite books of the year of all time. Yeah.
Yay. Yeah, I feel much the same. It's one of my all-time favorite books, so obviously 5 stars for me all around.
Yes.
I think for me, this book captured a feeling that I had never really witnessed in a book before, which sort of like so there's this idea in uh, with Korean culture called Han.
Hmm.
And it's this sort of innate feeling like to be Korean is to be Han is sort of like
Hmm.
a saying. And so Han is like this innate feeling of like bitterness or sorrow or grief. And so there is this sort of like sense amongst Koreans where it's like to be Korean is what's the word I'm looking for? Is to suffer basically.
Mm.
And I think for me in media, like I would see that and feel that in a lot of like because I you know I watch a lot of Korean shows with my
Hmm.
mom and everything, and I would witness that in my own family, but it was never something that I had like read and had interpreted into a novel before.
Right.
And so this was like that my first experience of like really getting to like feel that the sense of that in this story that
Hmm.
Min Jin Lee was telling. And so I love that so much, just like how much I connected with that emotional side of things in the book, along with obviously this like really grand sweeping story of this
Hmm.
family. And again, I feel like it tells a story that isn't often told in Western media about and really all media about like Koreans who live in
Hmm.
Japan and that experience and just like the experience of um, what it was like to be Korean during that time period and how it has continued to affect Koreans to today
Hmm.
was something that I really valued about the book too. And then in general, I just love multi-generational stories because I feel like a lot of the time, especially when they're unpacking like things like generational trauma, which I think this book also does
Hmm.
so beautifully.
Oh, yes. I love everything that you said, and I love that you sort of tie that back to, your own personal experience. And I love words that have multiple meanings and sort of complex meanings. So you describing Han was really interesting. And actually, as I was reading the book, there's this whole theme that Youngjin always brings up that it's like, a woman's lot to like suffer, or koseng is, I guess, how she says it. And I just thought that was such an interesting theme throughout the book that comes up. And I think in part, this book is about suffering, but also like trying to find the joy in life and the love in life. And there's so many meanings, and we'll get into it. But I just wanted to respond to how you said that. Okay, I'm gonna go to a few comments here. We have a lot of people who loved it, which makes me super, super happy. Um, we have someone who said, I knew nothing about it till I followed you, but how you all are talking about, I feel like I should go leave this live so I don't get spoiled. Yes, go leave because we're gonna get into spoils very, very cute, very, very soon. Um, it's such a beautiful and heartbreaking story. I'm surprised that each and every character held some sort of importance given how many characters there were. Yeah, that's a really good point. And I'd love to talk about this in depth. I'm like, I don't know what I want to start with to
Yeah.
discuss in this book because there's so much going on. It's a long book. It has so many characters, so many themes, and it like goes through this really long, almost century of a like people, a country, a section of the world, and like all of these different historical events going on. Um, but I guess we can start with. I'm just going to arbitrarily pick something. Let's start with characters, maybe the
Okay.
heart of the book. I love talking about characters, especially in books that have really big casts, and talking about our favorite characters and the ones that surprised us and the ones that just have a lot to unpack. So I guess let's start with who is your favorite character in the book, if you
For
had
sure,
to choose.
Senja.
Yes,
There's like
speak
no
about.
competition for me at least. I think for me, I struggle honestly to talk about her without crying. So
Yes.
I'm gonna work hard on that. Um, But Sunja for me, I feel like represents like
Hmm.
so many of the matriarchs in my own family and the women in my own family who I grew up watching and who I didn't really understand all that they went through. Because for a little bit of a background, my mom and my aunt were born basically right before or right during the time when North and South Korea were being formed.
Hmm.
And so they were born in a very different Korea than the one that exists today, and to a very different world. Neither of them were able to go to any sort of school,
Hmm.
and were homeless for a large period of time, and just they talk about those time periods and that time period, and it's when I think about them and I think about Sunja, I just think about all of the women who have had to suffer and carry this burden in order to sort of bring forth the future that we have right now. And it just like, I feel like it always fills me with so much awe. And so reading
Hmm.
her character meant a lot to me because I feel like it personified
Yeah.
um, a lot of that experience and a lot of like what I felt what I feel when I hear like my mom's stories or my aunt's stories about Korea.
Oh, that's such a beautiful answer for why you love sunshine. Oh my God. That got me emotional because I was just thinking about like my own mom and like, my own family background. Like, my parents were refugees from Sri Lanka, so like they went through a time and like an experience in their life that is very different from like one that I know, and like even the country that they came from is different from the one that they remember. And so like I completely relate with that sort of idea. And I see my mother in Sanja a lot as well.
Yeah.
So I feel that. Yes, I personally love Sanja. I think I love I was so scared for all of the characters in this book. And I like wanted the best for all of them. And like as things kept going on, I was like, oh my God, my heart is hurting. But I think if I had to choose a character who like, doesn't sort of is the least chaotic, I would say, of all the characters, because some of these characters make some really chaotic decisions, and I was like, why?
Yeah.
But if I had to choose one, it would be Mozazu, just because
Hmm.
I love him and I want to protect him, and he's such a sweetie, and I feel like he just like knows who he is and is just trying to do his thing. And I really sort of related to his sort of philosophy of like, so what if they hate me? So what if they hate us as Koreans? So what if I don't belong here? This is my home. Like I'm gonna exist here and I'm gonna take up space.
Yeah.
And I love that about him as a character, I think. So
Yeah.
yeah, Sanjan Mozasu, I think would be mine.
That's fair.
Let's see what other people are saying. I was connecting with Sanja as such a strong girl or matriarch. There we go. Yeah, I totally feel that. And I think she's sort of the backbone of the book and like what draws us through, and she's just like holding up this entire family, I think, throughout the book,
Yeah.
which is just so admirable. Okay, now let's get into, I guess, on the flip side, who's our least favorite character?
Oh, it's hard because
Yes.
there's like there are characters who I really dislike some of their choices.
Hmm.
Like obviously like Hansu,
Yeah.
gross man, like
Yeah.
get away from her. But at the same time, like as you continue with the story, it's like he
Hmm.
is sort of her only option so many times that like it like
Yes.
forces you to like not like him, but I guess like
Hmm.
just want her to find him because you know that when she
Mm.
does find him, like things will get like he'll help fix things.
Right.
And so there's that, and then like there's just that sort of deep frustration with Noah
Mm.
and the choices that Noah makes, but then also at the same time, like understanding what he represents.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's so difficult to like have a least favorite character because
Yeah.
like they're all so human, I feel like.
Hmm.
Um, even though I dislike a lot of their choices.
No, I totally agree with that. And I think with a book like this one, it's such a human book. Like it just shows the many, many sides of people. And I guess like rather than saying your least favorite character, maybe the most complex one, the one that you couldn't,
That's fair.
completely understand. Yeah. And I totally agree with that. I think I was most frustrated with Hansu and Noah. I think I had a complicated relationship with Hansu because on the one hand, I felt like Sunja when she's a teenager, where she's just captivated by him and the things that he does for everyone, and you want to believe him that he's like the good guy, but he's the quintessential bad boy, who is not here to be a good person. And we get big glimpses of that, I think, throughout the book, where like there are these like stark moments where he does terrible things, and you're like, oh yeah, this man is awful and a
Yeah.
creep. And I just found him to be a fascinating character, I think, overall, and like the way that he was written. Um, yeah, I could go on about
Yeah.
Hansu.
I think it's interesting, especially to like compare him with Isaac, because I
Yes.
feel like they are like so opposites, and at the
Hmm.
same time like both really frustrating in how they don't like how they try to help but also don't help Sanja.
Hmm.
And I feel this a lot because like I remember like growing up, it was something that I remember it's like a not a good thing, but like something that I
Hmm.
remember distinctly my aunt saying to my mom is like, if your husband fails, like it's your fault. And I
Mm,
feel like with
yeah.
women in Korean culture, and I'm sure in a lot of cultures, there's this idea like it's like you don't have the power, but at the same time you are expected to
Hmm.
you are the fault if things fail.
Yeah.
And I feel like both of them, like Isaac is such an honorable man as a foil to like how dishonorable Hansu is,
Hmm.
but like both of them like just fail Sanja in like actually improving her life. I feel like at so many different intervals. Like, yes, I find them interesting to like compare.
Hmm. No, I completely agree. And like what you said about sort of it's this idea that like women are expected to uphold the values of patriarchy and like, continue this system, and like, they're yeah, like just everything you said, I totally agree with. And I think, yeah, Isak was like, I loved him as a character, but I do agree that like he provided some things for Sancha, but he couldn't do everything. Like neither of them was sort of perfect, and she had to find, her own way of doing things in the way that she wanted to lead her life. And she ends up being a very like independent character without them as well, which I loved about her.
Yeah.
Um, I'm gonna go through a couple of our answers here. From the last question, oh sorry, yeah, from the last question, someone said I can't remember her name, but they loved Yosef's wife. Also loved her. Kyung
Yeah.
Hee, amazing person. She's such a sweetie and such a faithful person. And I mean, like she is a character who like strongly upholds like these very patriarchal values, especially like at the beginning of the book, when they're quite young. But I just love her as like a kind-hearted, warm person. And someone also about to steadiness and loyalty of Kyung Hee. So welcoming to Sanja. Yeah, and she also takes care of Sanja's mother like way late
Yeah.
in life, which I was like, oh my God, you're a saint. Least favorite Hansu. Love-hate
Fair.
relationships. Um, love how this book has a lot of strong women. I love Sunshine and Kim Hee. Yeah, that's a huge, huge theme. And we can get into that about all of the women in this book who are showstoppers and just amazing also. All right, we have another one. Hansu, I couldn't accept him at any point in the story. I feel that every time he helped, he was only doing what he should be. He owed Sanja that much at the very least. Yeah, he was doing the bare minimum at some points.
Yeah.
And I think there's this conversation that we could have about, there's this whole idea of like pride, and not wanting to take help from him because they didn't want to acknowledge him as Noah's father. But if you thought about it in sort of like our modern, way of thinking, we would be like, yeah, that's basically him paying child support, like, paying to support this child that he brought into the world, regardless of whether we view him as his father right now. And I just thought it was interesting. Also loved Mozazu. So interesting to see how the two brothers experience their world and make different decisions through thoughts and actions. Nice. But Pachinko and the Stationery Shop are top twos. Never
I
wanted
want to read
Hansu to
Stationery
find
Swap.
her. It's fantastic. Please go read it. I tell
Okay.
everyone. It's so amazing. If you love Pachinko, I'm sure you'll love Stationery Shop because it's equally heartbreaking, and just beautiful. And it's also like a bit of a generational story, and like spans a few decades as well. So I loved it.
Amazing.
Yes. Yeah, a lot of people. Oh, someone said Noah's boss was the worst. I'm forgetting
Mm,
who this was, but I vaguely the one who's this like pachinko boss. Oh no, Kazu. No, is
right.
that is that
Wait, the
Solomon's boss? I'm confusing people now.
the one
Yeah,
who I'm blanking.
yeah, no. Okay, so Solomon had like an awful boss. I think that was Kazu, and then Noah, I think, had a pachinko boss, but I don't really remember much about him. Hansu gave me the ick. I didn't like how controlling Yosub was. Oh yes.
Mhm.
I had a complicated relationship with Yosub. He was not my favorite at a lot of points, especially towards the beginning of the book with
Yeah.
how sort of, yeah, patriarchal values, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
This was also not my favorite. He was always let his ego get in the way, especially when they were like starving, they needed money, like I just wouldn't let them work. That was insane for sure. Yes, ego could have had them killed on a number of occasions. Yeah, agreed. Oh my God, there's so much to talk about, and I like don't know what to tackle next. I would love to discuss um sort of the different paths. So one of the like themes of the book is like sort of the different choices that Sanja could have made and the characters could have made. You know, had she told Noah about his father earlier, had she gone with Hansu, all these different things. If Mozazu hadn't stayed and like, got into Pachinko. And it was also interesting just seeing how like Noah and Mozazu's lives sort of paralleled each other towards the end. Um,
Hmm.
yeah, this is not a coherent thought, but I wanted to talk about it.
Yeah. I feel like it's hard because it's like when I think about the path that Sunja
Mhm.
chose or like all these characters chose, I feel like honor is such a big part of like
Mm,
all of their decisions, and that's like
yes.
such a deeply ingrained part of Korean culture, and like the idea of of dishonor is like so strong, so like immensely
Hmm.
negative that for me reading it, I'm like your life would be easier if you just like as
Hmm.
awful as it would be, like at the beginning, like if you would just like let Hansu take care of you, if you would just like
Yeah.
at the same time, like that he's not a good person. And that so I feel
Hmm.
like he is representative of like the dishonorable path. Um and at the same time, like you see like the men in Sanja's life then continue to sort of choose paths that they view as like honorable. So for
Hmm.
Yoseb, like it would be the ultimate dishonor to like have to be provided for by women.
Hmm.
And for Isaac, it's like he's so respectable and such a good person that also at the same time like his inability to like be dishonorable also like led them to a lot of conflict.
Hmm.
um and I feel like for Sanja, she like is sort of this like balance in the middle of all of them, where
Hmm.
I feel like she consistently makes the best choice that she can make, but she also like makes a bad choice if she feels like she has to, or bad
Right.
dishonorable choice. And so I really respect that about her, and I feel like that is again sort of a burden that is often put on women.
Hmm.
um and like men have the luxury of choosing their path, whereas she has to sort of like choose the path that's like between what's the word I'm looking for, has a lot less options, I guess, to choose
Yes.
from. um so I don't know, it's so difficult because like there are so many times that I'd be like, why are you doing this? You're making it so much more difficult for you, like why not just do XYZ instead? But I also understand like how horrible it would feel to like do a different option, I guess, like how.
Yes.
And it's that sort of sense of stubbornness that also like frustrates me
Hmm.
that I see in my own family, and I'm like, well, why don't you just do this? It would be so much easier.
Yeah.
Like just ask for help or something.
Hmm.
And yeah, so I don't know,
That
that was
no,
like
that was
very
a good
vague.
response. No, but I love that you tied it back to like honor as like a concept and like why they make the decisions that they do. Because I think that's like definitely a huge part of it, and it connects to like the overarching themes of the book and like this idea of them, you know, being in Japan and like feeling like they don't belong, and just wanting to hold on to this like honor and like these values that they have, and then realizing that they need to make some compromises to actually make it through. And yeah, it was just really really fascinating to me. Someone said so many what ifs. Um, Someone said Noah's decision to leave his family frustrated me. He never gave Sanjay a chance. We can get into this actually. We've
Yeah.
already gotten into spoilers, so we might as well just like jump
Oh, I'm
right
so
in.
sorry.
No, 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 it's okay. I think I started spoiling like 80 years ago, and I forgot to put up the spoiler banner, but it's fine. So let's talk about Noah and all of the twists and things that came with him. Um, I think Noah's trajectory in the story is the one thing that I never saw coming. Like aside from the way that his story ends, like I didn't see I always thought of him as like this, good-natured, like studious boy. And if anything, while reading the book at the beginning, I thought Mozazu was going to be the one who's going to be quote unquote like the problem child and like the one who would sort of make some poor decisions later on and end up in a different place. But it surprised me that it was Noah, and I think it was also so much more interesting because it was him. Um, and it was just heartbreaking as well because he was like the quintessential character with like so much potential and then so much is lost. And I think what also fascinated me about his character was his like own sort of warped self image, um, and self value, and how he couldn't reconcile the idea that like Kohansu could be his father, and like he thought of him as like Yakuza, and just all the dirty, bad things about his heritage. Um, and then he wanted to like sort of be Japanese. Like he felt that he needed to be quote unquote like in this cleanlier place, and pretend to be Japanese. And like just his whole storyline was incredibly fascinating to me, but also like so heartbreaking. And then the way his story ends, and it's like this very abrupt thing that's just sort of thrown out there. And Jinli does not like pull any punches. She's just like throws it there. You're like, yeah, she leaves, and then the next morning Kohatsu calls, and it was heartbreaking. And I remember like just setting the book down, and I was like,
Yeah.
I what? Yeah, it was. Oh my god. Okay, I'm gonna let you talk. 'Cause, yeah.
No, no. I think for me, like Noah represents a lot of like the idea of like firstborn son
Hmm.
syndrome. Like this this idea of like, I don't know, the idea of being the firstborn son and like having all
Yeah.
of this like hope and
Pressure.
potential put onto you.
Hmm.
And I do think like you bring up a good point around like the his um feeling of like uncleanliness
Hmm.
with everything. And I feel like that is also like something that I find really interesting, like looking at this time period and sort of the rise of like, we see it with Isaac and like the missionaries and the rise of like
Mm.
Christianity amongst the Koreans in Japan and also in Korea. And I feel like for so long to be Korean, like you were seen as less than, you were seen as unclean, you were um especially if you were living in Japan, like as we see in this book, like you are nothing. Like you are,
Hmm.
you know, and so to be constant, to be raised in that, to have that constant feeling of belittlement, I feel like religion and Christianity, this like sense of like cleansing yourself of that, I feel like
Hmm.
that's where a lot of that came from. And so then having like being raised in that upbringing, with Noah being raised in that upbringing, and then having this constant idea of being so smart and having so much
Hmm.
potential, but always being told that you'll never, um, that you're not worthy of that
Yeah.
potential. Um, and then to finally like get to like such a prestigious university and be working towards um, what you view as like such an honorable future, from such a dishonorable past, and then all of a sudden to be told that like this is actually your heritage, that your heritage is this horrifically dishonorable man.
Hmm.
And I feel like for Noah it's probably the sense of like I'll never be clean of this,
Hmm.
and I'll and this deep sense of like he'll never be free of this dishonor, like just innate to him.
Hmm.
um and so like it's hard because like I also, I feel like suicide because of dishonor is like also sort of a thing in Korea. Like you see it time
Hmm.
and time again. If someone has a controversy, um suicide is often the route taken, or oftentimes even like you'll be bullied into it.
Hmm.
And it's like something that is also just like ingrained, I feel like.
Yeah.
And so I feel like Noah represents all of that.
Yeah.
And it's so frustrating the choices that he makes because like especially for me, like I didn't grow up in that. Like I grew up in America.
Hmm.
And so that I feel like sometimes I'm reading something and it's like I can understand, but also I can't.
Right.
And it's sort of a weird like disconnect. But yeah, I don't know. I found Noah's character fascinating in that way. And again, like how he sort of how him and Mozazu like parallel each other and like are so
Hmm.
different. Um, and yeah, someone mentioned the vanishing half, and which is a retelling
Yes.
of passing, and I
Yeah.
also felt that too when I was reading it. And that sort of idea of like when you pass and then
Hmm.
suddenly like you lose that like social agency. Like he has such deep self-hatred for
Hmm.
being Korean. Um, and he has completely hidden that part of himself, and then to have that, he thinks he's maybe escaped it, and then he just knows that he'll never be able to escape like
Yeah.
all of this stuff that he hates so deeply about himself and his history. um there's like such a tragedy in that, because it's like that's what the world made him
Hmm.
too.
Yeah.
I don't know, it's
Yeah.
complicated.
No, I 100% agree. And like his character, he's definitely like a product of his surroundings and like the world and the circumstances that have made him into who he is. And it's like, his choices are all frustrating, but you're also like, I can't help but feel for you in this situation. Like, I am so sorry that you were driven to this point. And yeah, I definitely agree with Miranda here comparing this to Stella from Vanishing Half. I read that book recently and absolutely fell in love with it. And the second that Noah started passing as Japanese in this book, I was like, oh my God, this is like very reminiscent of Stella in that book, and like a situation that many people across the world have had. But it's just this interesting situation where like you think it's an escape and a reprieve from all of this sort of hatred that you face in the world and also the self-hatred that you've had. But then the very act of like being someone you're not just causes further inner turmoil and all of this. You brought up something earlier actually that I want to talk about how, the aspect of suicide and how like some people are bullied into it. And I was actually reading the acknowledgments the author wrote in the book. And there's like this moment in the book also. It's like this very like episodic moment in the book where Haruki, Nozazu's friend, who's the police officer, he goes to like a house, and like there's a child who has like jumped, um, and then they find out that like his classmates have been writing like all these terrible things about Koreans, in his yearbook. And I was reading the acknowledgments, and the author was talking about how that was like an actual story that she had heard, like an actual situation that had happened, and she felt so sorry for this child, and like she was just interested by this story and this idea of like Koreans in Japan, and that's where she started researching this. And I thought it was so interesting because she also mentioned how she thought the story was going to be like one way about like just the suffering and like how, unilaterally, Koreans were discriminated against it in Japan. But she was also, as she researched and talked to people in Japan and the Koreans in Japan, she realized that it was more it was more complicated than that, and like they had this deep love for the place that they had grown up in and been in. And I think Solomon's character sort of connects to that. Like later on in the book, he talks a lot about how it's not that black and white because he is someone who is generations past, like, been living in Japan, has been born and grows up there. And it's like this really complicated situation where he's both like having to register his identity and like renew his not citizenship, but like ability to stay there. But then he's also like, this is my home.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting. Like this book covers so many themes that I'm like, my brain can't hold on to it, but I'm also like, this is amazing. Yeah, I just wanted to say that. There's a few other comments here that I want to go through. Saddest part of Noah's story is that it's so relatable to so many different POC experience. Yeah, I think it's like very much like this sort of firstborn, and not even firstborn, but just like this idea that we need to uphold all of the hopes and dreams. Um, that it's something that a lot of people go through. Yeah, yeah, and I think there's something slightly universal and slightly not universal about like a colonial experience and like having lived under colonial rule, and just like having your whole life uprooted by
Mhm.
colonialism, no matter who is doing the colonizing. So I think it's definitely interesting. Um, Someone said the weight he must have carried in his new life pretending to be Japanese. He'd lost his job, his wife, everything he created after he had previously lost everything in his old life too. Yeah. He created his own mental prison by what he chose for himself to live in and live by. Um, right. I'm reminded of how we are considered, for instance, hyphenated Canadian American until it doesn't fit the narrative. I'm not sure 100% what this means, but yeah, everyone's bringing up a lot of great points, and Noah's just such a complicated character. Um, let's see, what is this one? It hurt to see how Solomon couldn't evade those expectations and experiences generations later. Yeah, and I think this book covers like that whole generational trauma and how it like reverberates through generations and like different people. And no matter, where they sort of started off, like they're all just going through this situation. But yes. Okay, I'm gonna move on to, I guess, I want to know what did you think of all the twists? Like, what was the most sort of surprising twist for you out of the whole book?
Hmm.
Because there was a lot of them, and like this,
Yeah.
this I just want to know personally as like a, reading the book, enjoyment factor, and like all of that. Like, what was the most surprising one that like, oh my God, this blew me out of the park?
Oh man. Most
I mean,
surprising.
Noah's a big one, but like a
Yeah,
second
I'm
one.
like, what would be bigger than that one?
Yeah, that was a really
Um,
huge one.
I think like just the ending also.
Hmm.
And Solomon's ultimate choice to
Hmm.
continue like to join his father at the pachinko parlor. I feel like that.
Hmm.
I guess it shouldn't have been a surprise because it's the title of the book, but yeah, I think that
Yeah,
one that kind of threw me.
yeah, that's interesting because I remember reading the book and I was like, I didn't know what pachinko meant, and going to the book, I was like waiting for it to sort of show up, and when it finally shows up, when like Mozaz is getting into it, I was like, oh, and I was like, this is such a strange title, like when I got to that point. And then as you learn, it sort of represents so many other things for the book and like the themes that it's tackling and this idea of like so many people thinking of pachinko as like this dirty, bad, you know, thing. And like that's also how people are viewing Koreans in Japan at this time.
Yeah.
And it just ties to so many things, but it's, even at the end, like I was talking about how Mozazu, oh bless you,
Thank you.
I was talking about earlier about how Mozazu was like kind of I liked him because he was kind of unapologetic about like just being himself and like whatever. But even at the end, he himself is like to Solomon, I don't want you to be viewed this way by everyone. You don't know what the things people will say. When you get into pachinko. And then Solomon's like, no, like this is what I want to do. And I agree. Like it was really interesting to see, and it feels like one of those things that shouldn't be surprising, but it kind of was.
Yeah.
So I agree, yeah, because it seemed like he was like in a perfect like sort of rom-com-y ending. I would have thought like based on Yumi, like his mother and his biological mother's wishes, like he would have gone to America and like lived this happy life. Like it's sort of what you're expecting, but of course this book has so many layers, and so he
Yeah.
comes back, and I love that as well. That's a good one that you chose. I think for me, one of the big twists, oh, this is actually really hard. I was okay, one of the twists that really, really surprised me was Hansu coming back the first time. I don't know why
Yeah.
it surprised me because I should have seen it coming, but for some reason I didn't think that he would have. It surprised me how much he cared about Sanja and the family, which is part of my like struggle with his character because I'm like, I want to like I know you're a bad person, but like some things that you do, I'm like, oh wow, you did actually care. But then it's like how much of you caring outvalues how much of a bad person you are, you
Yeah.
know? Like he does all these things, like he's watching over Sanja for so many years and like doing all of these things in the background to make sure that her family can keep surviving. But then he is also like the person who beats a sex worker in his car. Like
Yeah.
that is the range. So yeah, I think that one surprised me because I was like, especially even when he comes in at the beginning of the book, I was like, you are an awful person. You like consent is a whole questionable thing here. You are basically grooming Sanja, which is something that comes up later. And I want to talk about actually, I'm like totally switching gears here because I want to talk about this. But when we got to later in the book to Solomon and Hana. I want to talk about Hana as a character. I
Yeah.
want to get some of your thoughts on Hana.
Hana might also be the oh wait, am I confusing Hana with someone else? Wait, Hana is the
Is Itsuko, so Mozazu's girlfriend's daughter, the one who's in the relationship with Solomon towards the end.
Oh, okay. Yes, I was confusing her with Yumi.
Oh yes, yeah, Mozazu's girlfriend or wife, yeah.
Wait, so what are your thoughts on Hana?
Okay, so Hana basically she's such a complicated character for me because she's like so she's Tsuko's daughter for anyone who like needs a refresher. So after Mosazu's wife Yumi dies and like after they've had Solomon, he ends up dating this woman named Etsuko who is Japanese, and Etsuko comes from this like complicated family. She had a daughter and I think three sons or something, and she was a serial cheater. And she ends up getting divorced with her husband and starts dating Mozazu. But she has zero custody of her children, and Hana's the only one she talks to. And so there ends up being the situation where Hana comes to live with Etsuko and is meeting Solomon, and then they start a weird little relationship there. But I think Hana as a character was interesting because she was someone who came from quite a bit of privilege, but her life ends up in this like crazy trajectory and she sort of is someone who just can't get her head above water. And although she was suffering, I think what was hard for me to reconcile about her character was that she was suffering, but she was also doing terrible things. I think at the same time, she was sort of bringing Solomon into this relationship when he was like 13 or 14 years old, and like consent was like a questionable thing and another like grooming aspect because she was like quite a bit older as well, not that much older, but a little bit older. And she sort of like formed these formative moments in his life. And I found it interesting, I guess, that the author decided to showcase this relationship at the end of the entire generational story when that's kind of where we started
Mm-hmm.
with Kohansu and Sanja. So yeah, I thought she was just an interesting character. And then, even later after Solomon has like found a girlfriend and everything, he still keeps in contact with Hana. But and it seems like they're friends, but also like they're step siblings, so it's like weird and they've slept together. But I just found her to be an interesting character. And I feel like there's like more to her character. Just like I feel like she represents more, but I'm like unable to grasp it, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. But that's Hana, basically.
I feel like that would be sort of the I remember when I first read it, that was like the one thing that I always sort of wanted. I always found the women at the end of the book to be really interesting, and I always sort of wanted
Mhm.
more info
Yes.
about them. Um, of course, then this book would probably be twice the length.
Yeah. Oh, part two.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think actually this was bringing me back just because Hana gets into like some of the sex work and stuff. And I wanted to throw this back to so one of the references at the or a reference that is made throughout like the early parts of the book, especially throughout the colonial period and like the Korean War period, is the idea of so Ko Hansu always gives like Sanja this warning about how, if someone offers you work and says there's like better opportunities, don't believe them, don't go with them. And that's actually like a direct historical reference to comfort women
yeah.
being the euphemism that people use. Um, do you want to talk about like explain this, or do you want me to?
I can like explain comfort women.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so that was a term that's used to describe basically during uh, the colonization of Korea by Japan, and especially during World War II, uh, Korean women and girls were abducted and basically forced into these buildings where they were repeatedly and violently assaulted by soldiers. Um, and so it was like, and it's a horrific thing that happened in history that the Japanese government still tries very hard
mm-hmm.
to bury.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, so that's sort of that idea that she's
Mm-hmm.
referencing there.
Yeah. And I thought it was just so interesting because like I had actually studied comfort woman and like the whole history of that in university, and when it was brought up, I was just like, it's so insidious to see how like you can see a stat about like, oh, this happened to these women back then, but when you see it in sort of like this dramatized, fictionalized form, where it's like, this warning that this character is getting, or this situation that they've heard about, like, this so and so's daughter was like taken away, it like adds this sort of crazy human element to it that you're like, oh my God, this is horrifying. And it just like sort of like throws back to the idea of like, people are far less empathetic about a number that they sort of see on the news versus like a story that they hear from like their neighbor or, someone close to them. So I just thought it was really interesting that it was like brought up in that way so many times in the book. Because every time I was like, oh my God, like this is that. But yeah, that I'm starting to realize that this book is like a lot darker than like, I mean, I knew it was dark, but it's like, there's so much hope to the book as well that like you are still like carried through, and you're still excited for the characters and stuff, and you want to see the good and everything. But yeah, I'm gonna go through some of the comments here. Biggest twist, getting updates that Yosef was still alive. I find that this one's actually pretty funny. I honestly didn't expect him to last as long as he did.
Yeah.
Um, but I appreciated him. And also there's like the whole element of like Kyung-hee and like Kim Chang-ho, and how he was like desperately in love with her and she was sort of in love with him, but didn't want to dishonor this marriage. And yeah, I just found that whole situation like also an interesting one as well. The fact that he held on for so many more years. Uh, between Yosef and Sandra's mom still being oh my God, yeah, Youngjun being alive that long, I was like, damn. Also, like, just the way that she acts at the end of her life, which is like very common for old people to like be that way. Yeah,
Yeah.
she was precious, and I loved her. I mean, like, she said some mean things, but I was also like, yeah, I saw this coming. Like, okay, say whatever you want before you're gone. Um, let's see. I never made that connection between Kohansu and Sanjay and Solomon and Hana. Another example of how even generations later, their family is still enduring the suffering and the hardship. Yeah. Um, also theme of choices. Solomon is making some of the same choices with Hana and to work in Pachinko. Yeah,
I feel like
for
choice is
sure.
like such an interesting part of the
Yeah.
book itself. Like you brought it up earlier, and like the idea of pachinko, um,
Hmm.
and how it was like viewed as this really dirty thing. It's interesting because like if you go to Japan, there's pachinko parlors everywhere.
Hmm.
But I also think it's interesting like that was sort of I feel like it's such a good metaphor for the journey of these
Hmm.
characters, because pachinko is this like it's this supposed game of chance,
Yes.
but it is innately rigged.
Yes.
And I feel like that is like basically like these people are just sort of like
Playing
balls
a
in a
game of
pachinko
Pachinko.
machine that's been rigged against them.
Yes.
Um, and so like it's
Yeah.
like you view it as like, oh, they're making these choices, but like are they really?
Hmm. Yes. That's such a good point. And it's like they talk about it so many times in the book where like Moses is like fixing the machines and like making sure they work a certain way and like altering them every few days or whatever. And it's like very much this metaphor for the life that these people are living. And I think there's actually, now that you mentioned that, there was this quote from Etsuko, I think, when she like one of her parts of the book, she's just like thinking about this whole situation and comparing life to like a game of pachinko, which is, yeah, but that's when it sort of started to click that like, oh, okay, this is like all makes sense. Yeah, so many good metaphors, themes, layers to this book. Like it's just it does so much, and I think, yeah, like this author is just such an incredible writer, and put forth such an incredible story as well. Um, okay, I want to talk a little bit about the very, very ending, because I think it's so fascinating and
Mhm.
interesting. This idea that Sansa sort of goes to, I think it's Isak's grave, right? At the end. And she's just thinking about all the things that have happened, because we sort of don't see her for like a little bit at the end. Like she's, sort of there when Solomon brings Phoebe home, but like we're not getting her perspective for quite a bit at the end because most of her main plotline has ended. But we finally get this like POV moment for her at the cemetery, and she's just like thinking about everything and how like Noah hasn't survived up until this point. But then she makes this remark about how she couldn't believe that she and Kohansu had survived this moment and Noah hadn't. Um, and I just thought it was so interesting. I don't know. I have no real thoughts about it, but I just wanted to bring it up as like a discussion point because I think it was such a interesting way to end the book, I guess. Of all the ways I thought this book was going to end, I thought it was going to end with like Sunja on her deathbed, like imparting some grand wisdom, and like the kids, like, taking something home that they learned, and like the generations continuing on. But I thought it was interesting that, like, at the end, the two people who started this quote unquote story, um, are the ones who are still alive at the end. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. I don't know if I have any huge thoughts. I
Hmm.
liked the ending. I liked the like sort of like quasi burial moment
Hmm.
for Noah
Noah.
with the keychain. And so I liked that. I liked that it didn't feel like an end because it's not.
Hmm.
I feel like these
Yeah.
characters still continue, and I feel like it's so, especially because like I've watched now the first like couple episodes of the show
Hmm.
too, and I feel like seeing it visually also like sort of ingrained this even deeper in me, and that like all of this incredible history has happened, and then
Hmm.
at the end like you have your grandmother, and she's just
Hmm.
your grandmother, and like you look at
Hmm.
them and you don't think about just like everything they went through, or you have your mom and you don't think about like this epic journey that they went on to get to like where they are and to get you to where you are. And I feel like that ending, more like simple ending,
Hmm.
um I feel like really pushed like really like nailed that in for me, that
Yes.
feeling of like this is just a woman, like
Yes.
she's like the women that we have in our lives,
Hmm.
and she did what she had to do to survive, and she did survive. And I feel like there's something so beautiful about the fact that she survived, but heartbreaking at the same time that she had to survive so much horribleness.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, I don't know if that makes
That
sense.
was
It's
no, that made a
complicated
lot of sense.
feelings.
No, I totally agree with that because yeah, I love what you said about how like this is just your grandmother. Like, there's so much history behind these people, and like only a fraction we can only understand a fraction of what they've gone through, but they're still here, they're still standing at the end of the day. And it's just like an incredible feat. Like them existing is just an incredible feat. So yeah, amazing. Okay, we have like reached like almost the hour mark, so I'm gonna wrap us up. We've been talking for a long time, but I just want to keep going because it was like there's so much to talk about. Thank you so much, Monica, for joining me today to talk
Thanks
about
for having
Pachinko.
me.
I love this. These live shows just make me super, super happy. And yeah, I'm just gonna be thinking about this book for like days on end. So thank you for co-hosting because I would not have read this book. I mean, I wouldn't have gotten around to reading this book unless this had happened. So I think I would have just kept putting it off, and then I would have missed out on like an amazing book. So here we are. Um, Before we go, I wanted to remind everyone about our next book club pick for the Reading Club Book Club, which is The Sympathizer by Viet Thanh Nguyen. We are going to be joined by Elias, the amazing and awesome Elias, for our live show at the beginning of October. I'm super excited. I feel like we're having like back to back, amazing co-hosts, so I'm really excited. And that's about everything. Leave your final thoughts in the comments. I'll reply later on. And thank you everyone for joining us today and for discussing on a fable. And I guess we'll see you next time. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.